It started about a month ago. I am 32 years old. I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood is quiet, not to say rich, but it's quiet, and that's what I've always liked, especially at night, when you can hear the wind whispering, scraping outside your window, and it feels like the world has frozen around you. However, as of late, this silence has become unbearable. The first time I felt it was at night. I was lying in bed, almost falling asleep, when suddenly it seemed to me that someone was standing outside the window. I didn't hear footsteps or knocking, but it felt strange, as if someone was looking at me. A familiar feeling of unease tugged at my stomach. I got up and walked around the house, but found nothing out of the ordinary. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. The next night it happened again, but now the feeling was more intrusive. I woke up in the middle of the night, as if from a jolt, and I was sure that someone was standing outside the window. I got up, turned on the light, and went to the window, but there was only emptiness. Maybe the neighbor's cat. But the more I stared into the darkness, the stronger the feeling that someone had been there a second ago. I closed the window and pulled back the curtains. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every night the feeling of presence grew stronger. I could no longer fall asleep peacefully. I tried to convince myself that it was paranoia, that I was just working too much and sleeping too little. But somewhere inside there was a growing realization that it wasn't just my nerves. One day, late at night, I was sitting on the couch watching TV. I tried to distract myself, but I felt it again. That same cold, clammy stare. I abruptly turned off the TV. Silence came over me like a blanket. I heard something outside the window. A quiet scraping, like someone was running a fingernail across the glass. I froze, listening. My heart pounded in my ears and my breathing quickened. I slowly rose from the couch and walked to the window. There, in the darkness, a barely recognizable figure stood under a streetlight. It didn't move, but it was clear that it was looking directly at me. It wasn't a neighbor or a random passerby. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but I could definitely feel her eyes on me. I tried to call the police, but there was no way my phone wanted to load the screen. Damn technology. When I finally looked up, the figure was gone. I ran out into the street, but there wasn't a soul there. No footsteps, no rustling. It was as if nothing had happened. However, panic began to rise inside me. This wasn't a dream. I knew for sure it was real. For a few days after that, I didn't sleep at night, kept the lights on, drank coffee, but I could feel something in the house changing. The circles under my eyes were getting deeper. My thoughts were getting confused. But worst of all, the feeling of someone else's presence was getting stronger. I could no longer just feel the gaze outside the window. It felt like that someone had gotten closer. One night I heard rustling in my bedroom. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then the sound repeated itself. With a low whisper, as if someone was walking on my carpet, I froze, out of breath. It wasn't the sound of the wind or an old house. It was footsteps. I knew it for a fact. I grabbed my phone, but when I turned on the screen, it showed 0% charge, even though I knew for a fact that I had charged it before going to bed. In a panic, I looked at the door. It was ajar. I froze. I always locked the doors at night. Always. I carefully got out of bed and looked toward the hallway. In the darkness, I saw a figure, standing still, unmoving, and looking straight at me. She was inside my house. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just imagination, not paranoia. Someone had broken into my house. I don't know how long he'd been there, how many nights he'd watched me from the darkness, but now he was too close. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was just a nightmare, but when I opened my eyes, the figure stood even closer. I felt a cold fear paralyze my body. I wanted to scream, but my throat constricted and my breathing became ragged. Making a desperate dash for the door, I rushed out into the street and ran toward the nearest house. I knocked on neighbors' doors, shouted, but no one opened. The whole world seemed to stand still. I looked back at my house and the light in the window went out. Someone was standing on the doorstep, looking right at me. I never went back to that house. I called the police, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no prints. Only one thing was odd: they found footprints on the carpet in the bedroom, as if someone had been standing in one place for a long time. Since then, I haven't been able to sleep well. Every time night falls, I feel that look on me. No matter where I am, no matter what I do, it hasn't disappeared. It's just waiting for its next move. I've always been a heavy sleeper, the kind of person who, once their head hits the pillow, drifts off into a deep, dreamless sleep for hours. I've never had issues with insomnia or restlessness, so when I started waking up in the middle of the night, it felt. At first, I brushed it off as stress. Life had been hectic lately, and maybe it was just catching up with me. But each night, I woke up at the same time, 3:33 a.m. like clockwork. The room would feel strange, like I wasn't alone. You know that feeling when you wake up from a nightmare, heart racing, and you're unsure if the dream is still lingering around you. That's what it felt like. Only I hadn't been dreaming. The first few nights I did what most people would. I turned on the light, checked my phone for notifications, scrolled through a couple of social media posts to settle my nerves, then went back to sleep. Nothing unusual, right? But then I started noticing things. Small things, really. Like the bedroom door, which I always made sure to close, would be slightly ajar in the morning, or the window locked tight every night would be open just an inch, letting in a soft, cold breeze. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't closed the door all the way. Maybe I hadn't latched the window properly, but the unsettling feeling in my chest was growing, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been in my room while I was sleeping. I started triple-checking the locks before bed, but it didn't help. If anything, it got worse. A week after the strange awakenings began, I noticed muddy footprints next to my bed, small but distinct. It had been raining heavily the night before, so I assumed I must have tracked in mud myself and hadn't noticed. But the thing is, they weren't my footprints. I checked the soles of every pair of shoes I owned, but none matched the shape or size. These prints were smaller, like a child's or maybe someone with unusually small feet. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sent my pulse racing. Every shift of shadow in the moonlight made my skin crawl. When I woke again at 3:33 a.m., I didn't move. I just lay there, listening, straining to hear anything breathing, footsteps, anything that could explain why I felt so watched. I decided to do something about it. I went out the next day and bought a small security camera, one of those cheap ones you can control with an app on your phone. I set it up on my dresser, angled it so it captured the entire room, and hit record before going to bed. I felt a little ridiculous, honestly. What was I expecting to catch? A ghost, an intruder who somehow got past my locked doors and windows without a sound. That night I woke again as usual, feeling the same suffocating heaviness in the room, but this time I wasn't afraid. I had the camera. I just needed to wait until morning to check the footage. When I finally watched the recording, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The video started normally, me getting into bed, the lights going off, the faint sounds of my breathing as I drifted to sleep. For hours there was nothing, just darkness and the occasional rustle as I turned over in my sleep. But then, around 3:30 a.m., the camera picked up movement. A shadow appeared in the corner of the room. At first I thought maybe it was a trick of the light and odd reflection, or maybe the camera glitching, but the shadow began to move. Slowly, it crept towards my bed, a shape that was barely human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like it wasn't quite sure how to control its own body. It stood over me for hours, just watching, its head tilted down, face completely obscured by darkness. I watched myself on screen, completely unaware, sleeping peacefully while this thing hovered inches away from me. And then, just before 6 a.m., it vanished. No sound, no movement. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I was frozen, staring at the screen, replaying the footage over and over, hoping to convince myself it was some kind of joke. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe it was a shadow from outside, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching me. The symbols started appearing after that. Strange, jagged marks scrawled on the walls in what looked like charcoal. At first they were small, almost unnoticeable, but each morning there were more. They grew larger, more intricate, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. I had no idea what they meant, but every time I scrubbed them off, they reappeared the next night. I didn't sleep for days. I couldn't. I kept the lights on, but it didn't help. I could feel it, even when I didn't see it. The weight of its gaze never left me. I tried telling people, friends, family, but no one believed me. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Stress, maybe. Lack of sleep. The usual excuses. I even considered moving, but the thought of leaving my home felt wrong, like it would follow me no matter where I went. I don't know why, but I knew it was tied to me, not the house. The last night I stayed in that room was the worst. I woke up as usual, but this time I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel its presence, closer than ever before. And then, the whispering started. Soft, almost melodic, but twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. It was mocking me. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother telling anyone. I just drove far away from that house, that town. I found a small place out in the country, somewhere quiet, somewhere it couldn't find me. At least, that's what I tell myself. But every night, I still wake up at 3:33 a.m., heart pounding, waiting for the shadow to return. I don't talk about that night much anymore. but sometimes it still creeps into my thoughts. It was one of those experiences that changes you, sticks in the back of your mind no matter how much time passes. You know those nights that start off like nothing special, just hanging out with your friends, thinking you're invincible. That's what we thought that night. I was 14, my buddy Jeff was 16, and Tom was 15. We had this stupid idea to check out the old abandoned house on Elm Street. You know, the one every town has, crumbling, half falling apart, with all sorts of rumors surrounding it. The place had been empty for years, probably decades. The windows were broken, the front door barely hung on its hinges, and the yard was overgrown with weeds taller than I was. People said it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that stuff. It was just somewhere cool to hang out where no one would bother us. We got there just before sunset, squeezing through a broken side window to get inside. I remember the air being thick and stale, the kind that clings to you. The house was dead silent, like the world outside didn't exist once you stepped in. We messed around inside for a while, exploring rooms, cracking jokes, pretending we weren't creeped out. There wasn't much to see, just peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and a lot of dust. It wasn't until later, when it was starting to get dark, that we heard it. A noise, faint at first, coming from outside, something like rustling or scraping. We froze, all of us listening. Jeff, always the brave one, looked out the back window. "There's someone out there," he whispered. We thought he was messing with us, trying to scare us, but his face, he wasn't joking. We followed him to the window, peering out. That's when we saw him. There was a man in the backyard. He was tall, wearing a dirty coat, and he was digging. It was hard to see what exactly he was doing, but there was a hole, and he was burying something. I squinted, trying to make it out, and then I saw a black plastic bag. The kind you see in crime shows, you know, the kind that people bury when they're hiding something they don't want found. Tom cursed under his breath. What the hell is he doing? We should have left right then. Every instinct in my body told me to get out, to leave that house and never come back. But Jeff, being the dumb, fearless guy he was, whispered, "I'm gonna check it out." Before we could stop him, he was already heading toward the back door. Tom and I followed, but kept our distance. Jeff, being the oldest, always acted like he had something to prove. He stepped out into the backyard, moving quietly through the overgrown grass, keeping low. I'll never forget the way the man moved. He was calm, methodical, as if this was something he did regularly, like it was no big deal. His back was turned to us, and Jeff crept closer, keeping his eyes on the man the whole time. But then, Jeff stepped on something. A shard of glass from one of the broken windows, maybe. There was a sharp crack, and the man froze. I could feel my heart in my throat as the man slowly turned around. His face, I still remember it. Pale, cold, emotionless, like he wasn't even human. His eyes locked onto Jeff, and without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. "Run," Jeff yelled, and we all bolted, crashing through the backyard like our lives depended on it. Because in that moment they did. I remember the sound of our footsteps pounding the pavement as we ran, the adrenaline drowning out any other noise. We didn't stop until we reached the corner store down the street, the only place with lights still on. The sign outside flickered, casting an eerie glow on the sidewalk. We burst through the door out of breath, trying to explain what we'd seen to the cashier, but she just looked at us like we were crazy. We tried to catch our breath, thinking we were safe. But then, I saw him. The man, he had followed us. He stood across the street, just staring. For a moment we locked eyes, and my blood ran cold. He wasn't in any hurry, just watching us like a predator sizing up its prey. He circled the store a few times, slow and deliberate, his shadow stretching long under the dim streetlights. Each time he passed, my stomach twisted tighter, wondering if he'd come in, wondering if that knife was still in his hand. But he never did. After what felt like hours, he just disappeared, faded into the darkness like he was never there. We waited a while before we dared to leave, sticking close together as we hurried home. When we finally made it back, we told our parents everything. They didn't believe us at first, but when they saw how terrified we were, they called the police. The cops went out to the abandoned house that night. They found the hole the man had been digging and whatever was buried there. They wouldn't tell us what it was. They never found the man either. To this day, I still don't know what he was hiding or who he was. I don't think I want to know. All I know is something about the way he looked at us. It still haunts me. It's been years, but I can't shake the feeling that we saw something we weren't supposed to. And I'll never forget the way he moved, the way he followed us, like we were nothing more than animals to him. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about him. I wonder if he's still out there, in the shadows, burying more secrets, and if one day he'll come looking for us again. The eyes at the window. It was one of those rare summer evenings when the heat didn't suffocate and a gentle breeze drifted through the open window of my room. I was 15, the kind of age where you feel invincible yet still believe in the shadows that linger in the corners of your mind. My parents were out for the night, leaving me with my favorite horror movie, popcorn, and a sense of independence that felt thrilling. The first tap came as I settled into my blanket fort, a makeshift cocoon against the world outside. It was soft at first, like a moth gently flapping its wings against the window. I rolled my eyes, dismissing it as just a branch swaying in the wind. But as the minutes passed, the tapping grew more persistent, rhythmically echoing in the quiet room. Ugh, really, I muttered to myself, reaching for the remote to turn up the volume. But each time the movie reached a particularly tense scene, the tapping seemed to sync with the soundtrack, as if it were part of some sick joke. After an hour of half-hearted attempts to ignore it, my curiosity got the better of me. I paused the movie and cautiously approached the window. The moonlight cast an eerie glow, illuminating the yard, but there was no one there, just the trees swaying gently, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. I sighed in relief, telling myself it was nothing. But the next night, it happened again. This time the tapping was louder, more insistent. It felt like a summons, pulling at the edges of my bravado. I swallowed hard, my heart racing as I reminded myself of the countless horror stories I'd read. Each one began like this, an innocent night disturbed by an unknown force. My heart thudded in my chest, and I knew I should be brave. After all, it was just a window. I gathered my courage and crept towards the glass once more. This time I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping into my bones. With shaking hands, I pulled back the curtain and looked out. What I saw made my breath hitch in my throat. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness, reflecting the light like the eyes of a predator. They were impossibly large and unmoving, set against the black backdrop of night. A chill washed over me. An instinct kicked in, fear gripped me, tightening my throat. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. No response came, only the continued tapping on the window, this time sharper, almost angry. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding like a drum, and crashed into my blanket fort, pulling the covers over my head. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a raccoon. But the tapping didn't stop. It followed me from room to room, echoing through the house like an incessant heartbeat. I curled up on my bed, hoping it would fade away, but it only grew louder, more chaotic. I could hear it now, a scratching sound mingled with the tapping, like nails clawing at the window frame. My breath quickened, and I shut my eyes, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. As I lay there, I thought about calling my parents, but what would I say? There's something outside my window, they would just laugh it off. The tapping transformed into a rhythmic pattern, almost like a chant. It grew more frantic, more desperate. I covered my ears, but it only seemed to amplify the noise in my mind. And then, as if sensing my fear, the tapping suddenly stopped. Silence enveloped the house, thick and suffocating. I opened my eyes, heart racing, and glanced around. The darkness felt heavier, as if it were alive, pressing in on me. I gathered my courage and slowly peeked out from under the covers. That's when I heard it. A soft voice, barely a whisper, creeping through the stillness. Let me in, it beckoned, sending icy tendrils of fear down my spine. I froze, paralyzed by terror, and felt my heart skip a beat. "Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice shaking. "I'm right outside," the voice replied, still soft, yet laced with a predatory hunger. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I felt the urge to flee, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in my own fear. Just then, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past the window, darting just out of sight. My instincts screamed at me to run, to hide, but I was frozen in place. What if it was already inside? Then, without warning, the tapping resumed, louder than ever. This time it sounded like it was coming from the door. Panic surged through me as I realized it was trying to get in. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I leapt out of bed and ran for the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the cool tiles, trying to quiet my racing heart. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a low growl, a sound so unnatural that it sent chills racing down my spine. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me in a living nightmare. I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to dial 911, but my hands were shaking so violently that I dropped it, the screen cracking against the floor. The growl grew louder, more insistent, shaking the very core of my being. As I crouched in the darkness, all I could think about was how alone I felt. I had always scoffed at the idea of monsters, but now in my hour of terror, it felt all too real. It was right outside, waiting for me to make a move. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching into an unbearable tension. I could feel it, that sinister presence lurking just beyond the door. My mind raced with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. Then, out of the blue, I heard a knock. Just one. Soft, deliberate. "Let me in," it whispered, the voice now eerily calm. In that moment, I knew I was facing something beyond my understanding. This wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a trick of the dark. Whatever it was hunting me. As my mind raced with escape plans, I remembered the window the only way out. I turned, heart pounding as I approached it. My hands shook as I pried it open, the hinges creaking in protest. With a deep breath, I climbed out into the night, adrenaline fueling my movements. I didn't stop to look back, not until I was safely across the yard, the house looming behind me like a dark sentinel. Only then did I glance over my shoulder, my heart thudding in my chest. The window was empty, but the tapping had stopped. But as I stood there, trembling in the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I realized then that the eyes had not left me. They were still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. And I knew, deep down, that this would not be the last time I would hear that tapping. It would come again, and next time I might not be brave enough to look. Living alone has its perks: peace and quiet, no one to worry about but yourself. My little house on the edge of town has always been my sanctuary. I've been here for 5 years and nothing strange has ever happened, until last week. It was late. I'd just gotten home from a long day at work, and I was lounging on the couch, barely paying attention to the TV. The house was silent, eerily so. That's when I first heard it. A faint buzz, like a phone vibrating against a hard surface. I glanced at my phone lying beside me, but the screen was blank. No messages, no calls. It stopped. I brushed it off. Old houses make weird sounds, right? But a few minutes later, there it was again. This time, louder, closer. I sat up straight, feeling my pulse quicken. The sound was unmistakable, a phone vibrating, persistent, almost insistent. My phone still showed nothing. I muted the TV and listened, straining to pinpoint the source. The buzzing seemed to be coming from the guest room. Knife. I don't use that room. It's mostly storage, a place I never really go. I felt an inexplicable dread creeping up my spine as I stood and made my way down the hall. Each step felt heavier than the last. I opened the door and flicked on the light. The room looked just as I'd left it, boxes stacked against the walls, a neatly made bed. But the buzzing persisted. My heart was hammering in my chest as I followed the sound, my hands shaking. There, on the floor, under a pile of old clothes, was a phone. Not mine. An old flip phone, the kind that hasn't been popular for over a decade. It was scratched up, the screen flickering dimly, like it hadn't been used in years, but somehow, it was still vibrating. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I reached down and picked it up. The moment I touched it, the phone stopped vibrating. Dead silence. I glanced at the screen. 5 missed calls. My stomach twisted. 5 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I unlocked the phone with trembling fingers. The call log showed all the calls had come in within the past hour. That was impossible. No one had been in my house. I hadn't heard anyone come in. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again in my hand. I nearly dropped it. An incoming call from the same number. I stared at it, my mind racing. Who the hell was calling me on a phone I didn't even own? My thumb hovered over the answer button, but before I could press it, the call cut off. Then the buzzing started again, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the phone in my hand. It was coming from somewhere else in the house. I froze. The sound was coming from the living room now, where I'd just been. Slowly, I crept back down the hall, every shadow twisting and distorting in my peripheral vision. My throat tightened as I approached the living room, the buzzing growing louder, more aggressive. When I stepped into the room, my heart sank. There, on the coffee table, was another phone, an identical flip phone, buzzing furiously. My head spun. There was no way. I hadn't put it there. No one else was here. I reached for the phone, but the moment my fingers brushed it, the buzzing stopped, dead again, just like the first one. I checked it. 5 missed calls, same number. My breath came in shallow gasps. I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Before I could process what was happening, the first phone in my hand started vibrating again. I looked down at it, dread curling in my gut. Another incoming call. I didn't have time to react before both phones started ringing simultaneously. The sound was deafening, disorienting. I dropped the second phone, stumbling back, my heart thundering in my chest. They wouldn't stop. The sound was everywhere, pounding in my ears. Desperately, I grabbed the first phone and pressed answer. The ringing cut off, leaving a cold, suffocating silence in its wake. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no voice, just static. Then, faintly, almost a whisper, I heard it. "I see you." I nearly dropped the phone. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end. I looked around the room, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. There was no one. No one could be in here. The voice continued, growing more distorted, more menacing. "I'm right behind you." I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, inches from my back, but the room was empty. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. I hung up the phone, but before I could catch my breath, the second phone on the coffee table lit up again. This time, instead of an incoming call, there was a new message. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened it. "I'm in the house. My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone, my heart slamming against my ribs. I bolted for the front door, but as I reached for the handle, the lights flickered. Then, they went out. Pitch black. The only sound was my breathing, ragged and uneven. I fumbled for my phone, the real one, the one that had been in my pocket the whole time, and turned on the flashlight. I spun around, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. My house felt wrong, foreign. Every shadow seemed to shift, as though something was moving just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, lurking in the dark. Suddenly, the real phone in my hand buzzed. A new message. "I'm right here." I didn't hesitate. I flung open the front door and ran. I don't know how far I went, or how long I was gone, but I didn't stop until I was well away from the house. I'd been staying at a friend's place ever since. I don't know what I'll do. I don't even want to go back to get my things. I'm terrified of what I might find. But one thing is for sure, whoever or whatever was in my house that night, it's still there, and it knows my every move. "Daddy, there's someone under the bed." I've always thought of myself as a rational man. You know, one of those people who dismiss weird noises in the house as creaky pipes or a gust of wind. But what happened a few nights ago? I can't explain it. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, and no matter how many times I run it over in my mind, it just doesn't make sense. It started like any other evening. I was putting my 6-year-old son, Ben, to bed. He had his usual routine, brush teeth, a quick story, and then off to sleep. He's a great kid, rarely complains, rarely fusses, but that night was different. As I was tucking him in, he grabbed my arm and whispered, "Daddy, I'm scared." "Scared of what, buddy?" I asked, smoothing down his messy hair. He had this wide-eyed look, like he'd just seen something he couldn't quite understand. "There's someone under the bed." Now, you've probably heard this a million times before. Every kid thinks there's a monster under the bed at some point. It's practically a rite of passage. So I did what any dad would do. I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table, chuckling softly to myself, and told him I'd check. Kneeling down on the floor, I clicked on the flashlight and shone it underneath the bed, expecting to see a few old toys, maybe a lost sock, but instead, I saw Ben. My heart skipped a beat. My son, my real son, was under the bed, looking back at me. His eyes were wide, just like the Ben I tucked in moments before, but this Ben, he was terrified. His voice was shaky when he whispered, "Daddy, there's someone on my bed." I pulled back instantly, scrambling to my feet. My mind couldn't make sense of it. There was Ben, lying in the bed, and there was Ben, curled up under it, staring at me with tear-filled eyes. For a moment, I thought I was losing it. How could there be two of him? Then I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm, but I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "What's going on, buddy?" The Ben on the bed stared at me, unmoving, his face blank, too blank. His expression didn't shift, no blink, no twitch. He just watched. Meanwhile, the Ben under the bed began to sob softly, whispering over and over, "Daddy, please help me." I was frozen. My mind raced. One of them had to be wrong, didn't they? But which one? I took a step back, my flashlight flickering slightly as I pointed it at both Bens. The one under the bed reached out a trembling hand, pleading for me to help him. The one on the bed, though, he just sat there, still, unnaturally still. Daddy, the one on the bed, finally spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. "Come here, you need to lie down." I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. I glanced between the two of them, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Something was very wrong. The Ben on the bed was off. There was no emotion in his voice, no fear, no warmth, nothing that felt like my son. But the one under the bed, he seemed terrified. "Daddy, please," the Ben on the bed repeated, his voice eerily calm. "You're tired. Come lie down." Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to leave. But how could I leave my son, especially when one of them seemed so desperate for help? I slowly bent down again, aiming my flashlight under the bed. The scared Ben reached out further, and I took his hand. It was cold, clammy, and trembling. "Daddy, you can't trust him," the Ben under the bed whispered, his voice cracking. "He's not me." My breath hitched in my throat. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't know what to do. Should I pull this Ben out? Was he the real one? Or was this some kind of nightmare? Maybe I was just tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked back at the bed, the other Ben, he was smiling, a slow, creeping smile that spread across his face, too wide, too unnatural. "Daddy, come here," he said again, his voice low and commanding now. "You're so tired. Don't you want to sleep?" I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the Ben under the bed out with all my strength, pulling him close to me as I stood up. As soon as he was out, the other Ben on the bed began to move, crawling slowly, deliberately toward the edge of the mattress. His eyes locked onto mine, that same eerie smile plastered on his face. "You made the wrong choice, Daddy." I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed the real Ben at least. I hoped he was the real one, and bolted out of the room. We ran down the hall, his little hand clutching mine so tightly it hurt. I didn't stop until we were out of the house, standing in the driveway, gasping for breath. I haven't been back inside since. I called my brother, and we've been staying with him for the past few days. Ben seems normal, but every now and then I catch him staring at me, his eyes wide like he's waiting for something. I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know which Ben was real. And the worst part, I'm too scared to find out.